Well, you're in Sydney to receive the Sydney Peace Prize, and congratulations for that. It is a right and correct acknowledgement of your work. I think sometimes Australians can have a small view of themselves and look at what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Iran, and think that's a faraway place. It's not something I'm directly involved in or should get involved with. But what do you think, in a more connected world with globalisation, is the role of a country like Australia?
That's an excellent question. You know, for the past year, I've really been advocating for unity. The way the Islamic Republic has stayed in power, and a lot of autocracies and dictatorships stay in power, is by dividing and ruling. And that doesn't only include their own people. They're not just dividing and ruling their own people, because they understand that the people united will never be defeated. But it's also dividing the international community. And so as long as we are divided, freedom-loving, democratic countries are divided in how we approach Iran and how we approach the Islamic Republic, I should say, and the autocracies are united in their common objectives, this world has no chance. There will be no stability and global peace. Right now, we see the Islamic Republic sending drones to Russia to use against Ukraine. In exchange, they get surveillance technology from Russia to use against protesters and women protesting against compulsory hijab. And same with China, feeds the Islamic Republic with surveillance technology. So they're very much united in their common objectives, and we're just not. We need multinational approach towards the Islamic Republic in order to be able to tip the balance of power in favour of the brave protesters and hopefully see secular democracy prevail.
I mean, it's such a convoluted web, which would be, you know, too difficult to explain right now. But essentially, it comes down to countries like Iran, the Islamic Republic, its backers, and that web that we talk about. They're winning the information war in many ways, and you see Western democracies like Australia and their citizens, they're pitted against each other.
Absolutely.
Within.
Yes, and that threat of dividing people here, parties, you know, it's not only essential that we have a multinational approach, but a bipartisan cross-party approach towards autocrats and despots and tyranny. And until that happens, we have no way of succeeding. But imagine a free, secular, democratic Iran if the woman, life, freedom revolution prevails. It will not only create, obviously, an incredibly powerful and free democratic country, but it will basically support peace in the region and global stability. I think it benefits every Australian, every person in any free society, to fight for the rights of the Iranian people.
Nazanin, can you see that happening in our lifetime? We're similar age.
Yes.
Can you see that happening, you know, for the generation after us?
I can, and the only reason is because I see the tenacity and the resilience of these young Iranians who keep going. Hundreds of thousands of Iranian women are currently still flouting compulsory hijab on the streets of major cities in Iran, despite these brutal crackdowns. And with that type of courage, they can only succeed. What's
really complex as well is that many of our viewers will know that Saudi Arabia is getting very close to a normalised relationship with Israel. Iran and Saudi Arabia are rivals for power in the region. Saudi Arabia does not have a great human rights record. They do not give freedom to their women. But what role do you see them playing? I mean, this isn't a black and white debate. There needs to be some nuance here, doesn't there?
Absolutely. But what's happening again, because we're not united, because democratic countries are not united in a strategy to counter, as you said, propaganda, where China, Russia and the Islamic Republic spend billions of dollars on their cyber armies, on propaganda, we in the West spend in the tens of millions. There's a huge discrepancy there. We don't even know how to counter propaganda properly.
And sanctions don't work.
And sanctions aren't working, and mainly because a lot of them aren't even enforced. We can issue as many sanctions as we want, but if we don't have a strong enforcement regime, they're not going to, you know, for example, right now, the oil revenues in the Islamic Republic are higher than, you know, when the JCPOA was the first year of its implementation, by 15 billion. That's how much it's gone up. And you'd think with all these sanctions that it wouldn't, but here we are. So we need to enforce sanctions, but really the unity really needs to exist. And where there's a void in the Middle East, of course, China's going to come in and be the superpower, the main superpower in the region, brokering these deals. We can't let that happen. I think if we're united as free democratic countries against these dictatorships, against autocracy, then we can. There's no void to fill by an autocracy like China.
In free democratic countries, you have, I think, a loss of confidence and faith in institutions, and I'm talking about banks, big companies, the church. So I want to ask you about the UN. It has a massive role to play in exactly what we are talking about, but has it become a body that speaks to rhetoric, makes great speeches that we can all agree with, but when it comes to action, they are a little bit hamstrung?
Absolutely. Look, the Islamic Republic uses the UN to legitimise itself, normalise itself in the eyes of the public, global public. We had an early victory in women life freedom where they told us it couldn't be done, but we managed to oust the Islamic Republic from the UN Commission on the Status of Women, of course, the UN's highest legislative body on women's rights, which they should have never been a part of. But just 6 months later, the Islamic Republic became vice president of the UN General Assembly, and their representative chaired the social forum at the UN Human Rights Council. And we took 2 steps back. And so the problem with the UN is, yes, everyone has a seat at the table, and that's great. But when UN member states and their representatives don't stand for democracy, and they play into the Islamic Republic's propaganda and side with them, then we're never going to see change.
As an activist, I don't even know whether you like that term, by the way, I like it.
Yes.
But as an activist, can you see a pathway to the end game of what you're trying to achieve, or is it about making your life's work those steps and those important small steps forward? Do you just have to take the wins and the small wins where you get them?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, the victories may feel few and far between. This work can be quite demoralising because you're not waking up and finding a nation free and unjust laws overturned. It's a real slog. You have to keep going. But every time you see a hostage freed and the family reunited, every time you see an execution, unjust execution, a sentence stayed, every time you see an innocent person freed from jail, or democracy prevail, that makes everything worth it. So it's a long game, and I don't imagine it's going to be achieved overnight. But I think what we have to keep in mind is, as Bill Clinton said, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed with what's right with America. Essentially, that's true of every democracy. Yeah. The opposite is true with a country like Iran. The very pillars of the system ensure its wrongs can't be made right. That's where we come in. We have to ensure that justice prevails. What can we do to ensure that the Iranian people have all the support they need for self-determination?
Your brilliant brain and your sense of social justice is, I'm sure, what pushes you on every day. But I think that your day job, if I can put it that way, you're an actress, is such a hugely important role that you have as well. Can you just talk to me a little bit how the two work together?
Yeah, I think the common thread really is empathy, meaning, as an actor, I always say I get to portray the human condition and put myself in the shoes of a character and a person where I can play that role. You have to have empathy for a character or a story when you're portraying it on screen. And hopefully as an activist, I get to change the human condition. And again, you have to care, and you have to put yourself in another person's shoes to understand their suffering. So I think they sort of go hand in glove. You
need to know how to tell a story.
Yeah, it is hugely dependent on storytelling.
Nazanin, it's a pleasure. I wish we had a couple of hours more, and I hope we speak again. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.